The fear didn't start with panic. It started quietly, disguised as responsibility. She checked her bank account more often than she admitted. She opened bills slowly, already bracing herself for the numbers. What once felt manageable began to feel tight, then heavy, then suffocating. Losing her job wasn't dramatic. There was no argument, no explosion. Just a conversation that ended with polite words and an empty calendar. She walked out carrying her things, telling herself she would figure it out. But the weight of uncertainty followed her home and settled into every corner of her life. At first, she told herself it was temporary. A pause. A transition. She had been responsible before. She had always found a way. But days passed, then weeks, and the silence from her inbox grew louder than any rejection email. The bills didn't stop because her income did. Rent still arrived. Utilities still demanded attention. Groceries still needed to be bought. Each envelope felt like a reminder that time was moving forward, whether she felt ready or not. She began calculating everything. How many days until the next bill? How much she could stretch what was left? What could wait and what absolutely could not? Life became a series of mental spreadsheets she carried everywhere. What scared her most wasn't just the lack of money. It was the constant pressure of not knowing. The feeling that one unexpected expense could collapse the fragile balance she was trying to maintain. And slowly, without realizing it, fear became her background state. She didn't wake up afraid, she woke up already bracing herself for what the day might take from her. Her days began to blur together. Without a job to structure her time, mornings lost their shape. She woke up earlier than necessary, not because she had somewhere to go, but because anxiety wouldn't let her sleep any longer. Silence filled the apartment in a way that felt louder than noise. She checked her email obsessively, refreshing the inbox as if effort alone could summon an opportunity. Every notification made her heart jump. Every empty refresh felt like rejection, even when no one had responded at all. Waiting became its own form of exhaustion. Job applications turned into a daily ritual. She rewrote her resume countless times, convinced there had to be a better version of herself she could present. Each submission carried a quiet hope, followed by the familiar disappointment of no immediate reply. As days passed, she became hyper-aware of spending. She avoided unnecessary lights. Measured groceries carefully. Put items back on shelves, reminding herself she didn't need them. Money stopped being a tool and became a source of tension woven into every choice. She stopped talking openly about her situation. Friends asked how things were going, and she answered vaguely. Saying, "I'm fine," felt easier than explaining the fear that sat in her chest all day. She didn't want pity. She didn't want advice. She wanted stability. Nights were the hardest. When distractions faded, her thoughts grew louder. She replayed worst-case scenarios, imagining overdue notices, uncomfortable conversations, and futures she didn't want to face. Fear didn't scream, it whispered, over and over, "What if this doesn't work out?" And slowly, she began to realize something unsettling. She wasn't just worried about money anymore. She was living inside the worry, letting it shape her thoughts, her expectations, and the way she imagined her future. As the weeks passed, the fear began to change how she saw herself. It wasn't just about being unemployed anymore, it was about feeling disposable. Each unanswered application chipped away at her confidence, making her question her value in ways she never had before. She caught herself replaying old moments, searching for mistakes. Conversations at work. Decisions she had made. Signs she thought she should have noticed earlier. The loss of the job slowly turned into a story she told herself about failure, even though nothing about her effort had changed. Her inner dialogue grew harsher. Thoughts like, "I should be further by now," and "I can't afford to mess this up," repeated daily. Fear no longer lived only in her circumstances, it lived in her identity. She started defining herself by what she lacked instead of what she was capable of. She avoided mirrors more than usual, not because of how she looked, but because she didn't recognize the woman staring back at her. The lightness she once carried felt distant. In its place was tension, vigilance, and a constant sense of being behind. Money worries seeped into everything. Even moments that should have felt neutral carried an edge of guilt. Rest felt undeserved. Enjoyment felt irresponsible. She believed that if she allowed herself to relax, reality would punish her for it. What she didn't realize yet was that fear had become her dominant emotional state. It was the lens through which she interpreted every situation, every silence, every delay. And from that place, it became harder to imagine anything different. Still, beneath the fear, something quieter remained. A part of her that knew this wasn't how life was meant to feel. That part hadn't disappeared, it was just waiting for space to be heard. Eventually, the exhaustion reached a point she could no longer ignore. It wasn't just physical tiredness, it was the weariness of constantly bracing for bad news. Her body felt tense even when nothing was happening, as if danger were always just a moment away. One afternoon, sitting alone at the kitchen table, she stared at a stack of unpaid bills and felt something inside her finally crack. Not in panic, not in tears, but in quiet defeat. She realized she couldn't keep living in a state of constant alarm and expect clarity to emerge from it. For the first time, she admitted a truth she had been avoiding. Fear had taken over her inner world. Every thought started with lack. Every expectation leaned towards struggle. Even when nothing bad happened, she was already preparing for it. She asked herself a question that unsettled her: what if this fear is part of what's keeping me stuck? The idea felt uncomfortable, almost irresponsible. But once it appeared, she couldn't unsee it. She began to notice how often she imagined things getting worse instead of better. How naturally her mind rehearsed rejection, failure, and instability. It wasn't intentional, it was automatic. A habit she had built without realizing it. The realization didn't bring immediate relief. It brought awareness. She could see now that while her circumstances were real, the way she was relating to them might be amplifying the pressure instead of helping her move forward. That afternoon marked a quiet turning point. Nothing changed on the outside. The bills were still there. The job search was still uncertain. But internally, a new question had been planted, and it refused to stay silent. A few days later, during one of those long afternoons that felt heavier than the rest, she left the apartment just to clear her head. She didn't have a plan or a destination. She just needed movement, something to break the cycle of worry that kept looping inside her. She wandered into a small bookstore she had passed countless times but never entered. It wasn't intentional. It was instinct. The kind of place you step into when you're trying to escape your own thoughts for a moment. The air inside was quiet, steady, almost grounding. As she walked slowly between the shelves, a thin book caught her attention. It wasn't the title that pulled her in at first, it was a folded piece of paper tucked between its pages, sticking out slightly, as if someone had left it behind on purpose. She opened the book out of curiosity, and her eyes landed on a simple sentence written on the paper: "You don't attract what you want. You attract what you live in emotionally." She read it once, then again. Something about it felt uncomfortably accurate. The book spoke about the law of attraction, not as wishful thinking, but as a reflection of internal patterns. It explained how fear, when sustained, becomes a state, and how that state quietly shapes decisions, expectations, and outcomes over time. For the first time, her situation felt explainable instead of personal. She wasn't broken. She wasn't being punished. She had been living in constant fear of the bills, and that fear had become the emotional environment she carried everywhere. She closed the book slowly, heart beating a little faster. Nothing outside had changed yet. But inside her, a new understanding had taken shape, and it made one thing clear. If her inner state mattered this much, then changing it wasn't optional anymore. After that afternoon, the idea stayed with her. Not as motivation, but as discomfort. She couldn't stop noticing how often fear guided her thoughts. How quickly her mind jumped to unpaid bills, rejection emails, and worst-case scenarios. The law of attraction didn't feel abstract anymore, it felt uncomfortably present. Still, knowing wasn't the same as doing. She didn't wake up the next day suddenly calm or confident. Fear didn't disappear just because it had been named. If anything, she became more aware of how deeply ingrained it was. Awareness brought responsibility, and that felt heavy. She tried telling herself different things in her head. Things will work out. I'll be okay. But the words felt hollow, disconnected from how she actually felt. Repeating them mentally only made the gap between her thoughts and emotions more obvious. What frustrated her most was not knowing where to begin. The book explained the principle, but it didn't tell her how to live differently when reality still demanded answers. Bills still needed to be paid. The job market was still quiet. Hope felt risky. She realized that her mind moved too fast for quiet affirmations. Thoughts spiraled before she could catch them. Fear filled the space instantly. If she was going to change her internal state, she needed something slower. Something that could interrupt the noise. That's when she noticed how much clarity came when she wrote things down, even simple lists, even numbers. Writing forced her to pause. To slow her thoughts enough to actually see them instead of drowning in them. She didn't know it yet, but that realization was pointing her toward the one tool that would anchor everything that followed. Not as a ritual. Not as magic. But as a way to consciously shift what she was living in emotionally. That night, she took an old notebook from a drawer and placed it on the table in front of her. It wasn't special. It wasn't new. But it was empty, and that felt important. She opened the first page without knowing exactly what she was supposed to write. At first, the words that came out were honest, not hopeful. She wrote about fear. About the bills stacked on the counter. About the anxiety that followed her from morning to night. Seeing those thoughts on paper made something shift, they stopped feeling endless and started feeling visible. Then she remembered what she had read about the law of attraction. About emotional states. About repetition. Slowly, she turned the page and decided to try something different. Not to deny reality, but to choose a new internal direction. Her hand hesitated as she wrote her first affirmation. I am safe, even while things are still unfolding. It didn't feel true yet. But it felt possible. On the next line, she wrote. Money flows to me in expected and unexpected ways. Her chest tightened slightly as she read it back. Fear wanted to argue. She let the sentence stay anyway. She continued, slower now. I trust that solutions are aligning for me. Each word felt like a quiet act of resistance against the panic she had been living in. The notebook became more than a place to vent. It became her journal manifestation, a space where she practiced the law of attraction intentionally, one sentence at a time, even when doubt was still present. When she closed the notebook that night, nothing in her bank account had changed. The bills were still there. But something inside her had shifted just enough to matter. For the first time in weeks, she felt a small sense of steadiness, not because she knew how things would work out, but because she had chosen a different emotional state to live in. The next morning didn't feel miraculous, but it felt different. She woke up with the familiar awareness of her situation, yet the panic didn't rush in as quickly as before. There was a pause, brief, subtle, but noticeable. And in that pause, she realized the journal manifestation had already begun doing its work. Throughout the day, she caught herself reaching for the notebook more than once. Not out of desperation, but out of grounding. Whenever her thoughts started spiraling toward unpaid bills or imagined disasters, she wrote instead of worrying silently. Writing slowed her down. It brought her back to the present moment. She noticed how fear lost some of its power once it was interrupted. The same thoughts still appeared, but they didn't dominate the entire day. Each time she returned to the journal, she reminded herself of the affirmations she had written, not as promises, but as directions. One afternoon, she added new lines to the page. I am open to opportunities one cannot see yet. My financial situation is changing, even when it feels slow. Reading those sentences didn't erase uncertainty, but it softened her resistance to it. What surprised her most was how her body responded. Her shoulders relaxed more easily. Her breathing slowed. Anxiety no longer felt constant, it came in waves instead of living there permanently. That shift alone felt significant. She also noticed subtle changes in her behavior. She responded to emails sooner. Followed up on applications she had almost abandoned. Made calls she had been postponing out of fear. The journal wasn't pushing her, it was steadying her. By the end of the week, she understood something important. The law of attraction wasn't about forcing positivity. It was about choosing where to live emotionally. And through the journal manifestation, she was learning, slowly, intentionally, how to live somewhere new. The changes didn't arrive as breakthroughs. They arrived quietly, almost easy to dismiss if she wasn't paying attention. An email that sounded warmer than the others. A response that didn't feel automated. A short message that ended with, "Let's talk." None of it guaranteed anything, but none of it felt like rejection either. What stood out wasn't just what was happening, but how she was receiving it. In the past, every small opening would trigger anxiety. She would immediately imagine what could go wrong. Now, she noticed herself staying present, allowing the moment to exist without rushing to conclusions. She continued writing in her journal manifestation each morning and night. One entry read, "I am open to conversations that lead me forward." Another followed naturally. "I trust the timing of what is unfolding." The words felt less forced now, more familiar. She began to realize that her attention had shifted. Instead of scanning for threats, she was noticing movement. Possibility. Flow. Even delays felt less personal. Silence no longer meant failure, it simply meant the story wasn't finished yet. Financially, nothing dramatic had changed. The numbers were still tight. The bills were still real. But her relationship with them was different. She stopped seeing them as proof of collapse and started seeing them as part of a temporary chapter. One afternoon, she caught herself smiling at something small, a thought that would have felt impossible weeks earlier. The smile surprised her. It wasn't relief. It was recognition. A sense that she was no longer stuck in the same emotional place. She understood then that manifestation wasn't about controlling outcomes. It was about staying aligned long enough for movement to continue. And for the first time since losing her job, she felt like things were finally responding. A few days later, one of those conversations turned into something more specific. Not an offer, not a promise, but an invitation to explore a possibility. A call was scheduled. A time was set. For the first time in weeks, her calendar held something other than waiting. She noticed how her body reacted differently this time. Instead of panic tightening her chest, there was a grounded alertness. She prepared without obsessing. Reviewed her experience without trying to rewrite her entire identity. The journal manifestation stayed open on the table beside her as a quiet reminder to stay aligned. The morning of the call, fear tried to return. Old thoughts surfaced, warning her not to expect too much. She acknowledged them, then opened the journal and wrote, "I show up calm, prepared, and confident." Writing it didn't erase the nerves, it steadied them. The conversation flowed more easily than she anticipated. There was interest. Genuine curiosity. Questions that invited her to speak about her skills instead of defending her gaps. She felt present, engaged, and surprisingly at ease. When the call ended, she didn't rush to interpret it. She didn't replay every sentence searching for hidden meaning. She simply noted how different the experience felt, not because the outcome was guaranteed, but because she hadn't abandoned herself in the process. Later that day, she added another line to her journal. I allow opportunities to develop without pressure. The sentence felt true. Comfortable. Like something she was finally learning to live by. She still didn't know how everything would resolve. Financial stability hadn't arrived yet. But something important had shifted again. The silence had broken, and movement, real movement, had begun. After that first conversation, more responses began to appear. Not all of them led somewhere, but the tone had changed. Messages felt warmer. Exchanges felt human. Even rejection, when it came, no longer carried the same emotional weight. She could feel the difference immediately. What surprised her most was how steady she remained. Before, any movement would have sent her into overanalysis. Now, she noticed herself staying grounded, trusting that each interaction was part of a larger unfolding. The law of attraction no longer felt like a theory, it felt like something she was living. Her journal manifestation became a daily anchor. Each morning, before opening her email, she wrote a few lines to set her emotional state. One morning read. I am supported while I search. Another followed. I am guided toward financial stability. Writing these affirmations didn't make her passive. It made her intentional. She applied for positions with clarity instead of desperation. She spoke from experience instead of fear. The difference showed, even to her. She began noticing how her self-talk had softened. The harsh inner voice that once questioned her worth had grown quieter. In its place was a steadier tone, one that acknowledged uncertainty without letting it define her. Financial pressure still existed, but it no longer dominated her identity. She stopped waking up with dread. She allowed herself moments of rest without guilt. Stability was becoming something she could emotionally hold, even before it fully arrived. Looking back, she realized something important. The journal manifestation wasn't just changing her thoughts, it was changing her relationship with time. She was no longer rushing the outcome. She was staying aligned with the process. And in that alignment, confidence didn't feel forced. It felt earned, built slowly through presence, consistency, and trust in what was unfolding. The first sign didn't arrive as a paycheck. It arrived as relief. A small, unexpected payment she had forgotten about. Not enough to solve everything, but enough to ease the pressure that had been tightening her chest for weeks. When she saw the number, she exhaled deeply, almost in disbelief. In the past, she might have dismissed it as coincidence. Or told herself it didn't matter because it wasn't enough. This time, she paused. She felt the moment instead of minimizing it. The law of attraction had taught her to notice movement, not just outcomes. She opened her journal manifestation and wrote immediately. Money is finding its way to me. Then, beneath it, I acknowledge every sign of stability. The act of writing felt grounding, as if she were anchoring the experience instead of letting it pass unnoticed. That small shift changed how she viewed the rest of the day. The bills still existed, but they no longer felt like proof of failure. They felt temporary. Manageable. Part of a transition instead of a sentence. She realized how often she had ignored progress in the past because it didn't look dramatic enough. Fear had trained her to only recognize change when it was overwhelming. Now, she was learning to respect subtle movement as evidence of alignment. Later that evening, she noticed her thoughts drifting toward gratitude instead of calculation. Not forced gratitude, just recognition. Recognition that something was responding. That the constant, no, she had been living with was slowly being replaced with, not yet, and, maybe. That night, she wrote one more line before closing the journal. I trust the process unfolding in front of me. And for the first time since losing her job, she went to sleep feeling supported rather than braced for impact. After that small but meaningful sign, things began to feel less random. Not suddenly easy, but steadier. Opportunities didn't appear all at once, yet they started arriving with more regularity, as if the silence she had lived in for so long was finally breaking. She noticed a rhythm forming. Calls followed emails. Conversations led to second conversations. Even when something didn't move forward, it no longer felt like a dead end. Each interaction seemed to carry information, direction, or clarity she hadn't had before. Her journal manifestation reflected that shift. The pages no longer centered on fear or survival. They focused on continuity. One morning, she wrote, I am building financial stability step by step. The sentence felt grounded, realistic, and surprisingly calm. She realized that stability wasn't arriving as a single moment, it was assembling itself through consistency. Through showing up repeatedly without collapsing into doubt. Through staying aligned even when outcomes were still forming. What changed most was her relationship with uncertainty. Before, not knowing had felt unbearable. Now, it felt tolerable. Even neutral. She trusted herself to navigate whatever came next without spiraling back into fear. Financially, she was still careful. But she stopped obsessing. Numbers no longer defined her worth or dictated her emotional state. They became information instead of threats. And in that steadiness, she sensed something important. This wasn't luck finding her. This was alignment holding long enough for stability to begin taking shape. Then came the conversation that felt different from the rest. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't vague. It carried intention. She could sense it from the first few minutes. This wasn't just another possibility drifting by. It was something forming with structure and direction. The role wasn't exactly what she had imagined months earlier, but it aligned with her skills and experience in a way that felt natural. There was clarity around expectations, compensation, and next steps. For the first time since losing her job, money was being discussed without tension or apology. After the call, she didn't celebrate immediately. She sat quietly, letting the moment settle. In the past, excitement would have quickly turned into fear of losing it. This time, she noticed herself staying grounded, trusting that whatever unfolded next would meet her with stability rather than collapse. She opened her journal manifestation and wrote slowly. I allow stable income to enter my life. Then beneath it, I am worthy of financial security. The words felt strong, not dramatic, but true. What stood out wasn't just the opportunity itself, but how prepared she felt to receive it. Her nervous system wasn't in survival mode anymore. She could think clearly, ask questions, and make decisions without panic clouding her judgment. She realized then that the law of attraction wasn't about forcing outcomes to arrive faster. It was about becoming emotionally ready for what she had been asking for. And that readiness had been built one page at a time. As the possibility continued to take shape, one thing became clear. Financial stability no longer felt like a distant idea. It felt like something actively unfolding, something she could finally meet with confidence instead of fear. As the days passed and the possibility moved closer to becoming real, the old fear tried to return. It didn't arrive as panic, but as doubt. Quiet thoughts surfaced late at night, asking what she would do if this fell apart too. Fear didn't scream anymore, it tested her. She noticed the difference immediately. Before, those thoughts would have consumed her entire day. Now, They appeared briefly, like echoes from a chapter she was already leaving behind. She recognized them for what they were, habit, not truth. Still, the uncertainty felt heavy at times. Waiting for confirmation stirred memories of past disappointments. Her body remembered instability, even when her mind knew things had changed. She allowed herself to feel that tension without letting it take control. That evening, she opened her journal manifestation again. Not to fix fear, but to meet it with awareness. She wrote, "I am safe even while I wait." Then added, "I trust what is aligning for me." Writing those words didn't erase the uncertainty, but it grounded her. It reminded her that fear no longer dictated her emotional state. She had learned how to stay present instead of spiraling ahead into imagined endings. She reflected on how different this waiting felt compared to the past. There was no desperation, no bargaining with the future. Just patience, steadiness, and a quiet confidence that she hadn't felt before. And in that calm space, she understood something important. The final test wasn't about money or timing, it was about whether she would return to fear or remain aligned. This time, she chose alignment. The confirmation arrived quietly, without drama. A message, a call, clear words that didn't leave space for doubt. The role was hers. The terms were defined. The income was stable. When she heard it, her body reacted before her mind could, a deep breath she didn't realize she had been holding finally released. She sat still for a moment after the call ended, letting the reality settle. There was no rush of adrenaline, no disbelief. Just a calm sense of arrival. This wasn't a rescue. It was a result. And that distinction mattered. She opened her journal manifestation almost instinctively. Her hand moved slowly as she wrote, "I receive financial stability with gratitude." Then, after a pause, "I am supported." The words felt anchored, grounded in experience rather than hope. What struck her most was how natural it felt to receive good news without immediately expecting it to disappear. Fear didn't rush in to warn her. Doubt didn't question her worth. She allowed the moment to exist fully. The bills that once felt threatening now felt manageable. Not erased, not ignored, simply addressed from a place of stability instead of panic. The pressure that had defined her days began to loosen its grip. She realized then that stability wasn't just about money arriving. It was about her nervous system recognizing safety again. And that recognition changed everything. For the first time in months, she didn't feel like she was surviving. She felt like she was standing on solid ground. The days that followed confirmed what she already felt internally. Her routine began to rebuild itself around certainty instead of anxiety. Mornings had structure again. Plans extended beyond the next bill. Time stopped feeling like an enemy. She noticed how differently she moved through the world. Her posture softened. Her thoughts slowed. She wasn't scanning for danger anymore. She was present, engaged, responsive. The change was subtle but undeniable. Her journal manifestation evolved with her. The affirmations shifted from calling stability into anchoring it. One morning she wrote, "I maintain financial balance with ease." Another day, "Money supports my life, not my fear." Writing no longer felt like effort. It felt like alignment maintenance. A way to stay connected to the state that had brought her here. She wasn't manifesting from lack anymore, she was reinforcing stability. She reflected on how different her life felt compared to the weeks after losing her job. The contrast was striking. Same woman. Same abilities. Completely different internal environment. The law of attraction no longer felt like something she was practicing. It felt like something she understood deeply. Her emotional state had shaped her reality, and now she was choosing it consciously. Stability had arrived, but more importantly, she knew how to stay aligned with it. Looking back, she could finally see that the shift had started long before any money arrived. It began the moment she stopped living entirely from fear of the bills and started questioning the emotional state she was carrying every day. At the time, it didn't feel like a breakthrough. It felt uncomfortable, subtle, almost invisible. But that was where everything truly began to change. She remembered how foreign it felt to imagine stability while her reality still demanded answers. Writing affirmations in the journal manifestation had felt almost confrontational at first, as if she were challenging a version of herself that only knew how to survive. Fear argued with every sentence she wrote. Doubt questioned every intention. And still, she kept writing. What she understood now was that the journal hadn't been about convincing the universe to give her money. It had been about interrupting the emotional loop she had lived inside for so long. The constant anticipation of loss. The expectation that something would go wrong. The belief that stability was fragile and temporary. Writing changed the environment where those beliefs lived. The more consistent she became, the more she noticed how her focus shifted. She stopped scanning her life for proof of failure and began noticing movement, possibility, and response. Small signs that would have gone unnoticed before suddenly felt meaningful. Not because they solved everything, but because they showed her that things were not frozen. She realized then that manifestation wasn't something that happened to her. It was something that unfolded through her. Through her emotional availability. Through her willingness to stay aligned even when the outcome wasn't guaranteed. Through her choice to stop rehearsing collapse every day. The journal manifestation became evidence of that internal evolution. Page after page reflected a mind slowly moving from panic to presence. From fear to clarity. From survival to trust. She didn't become fearless, she became aware. And awareness gave her options she never felt she had before. What felt most empowering wasn't the financial stability itself, but the understanding that she could recognize misalignment when it appeared and gently redirect herself. She no longer felt trapped inside fear. She felt capable of choosing differently. And that capacity changed how she related to everything that followed. Financial stability didn't arrive as a dramatic transformation that erased every concern overnight. Her life didn't suddenly become effortless or free of responsibility. What changed was the weight she carried internally. Challenges still existed, bills still needed attention, but none of it felt suffocating anymore. She was no longer living with the constant sense that one mistake could ruin everything. She noticed how differently she responded to everyday situations. Numbers no longer triggered panic. Decisions no longer felt urgent in a way that drained her. She could pause, assess, and choose without fear hijacking her thoughts. That sense of internal steadiness felt more valuable than the stability itself. The journal manifestation remained part of her routine, not as a safety net born from fear, but as a grounding practice. Writing had become a way to stay connected to clarity. One evening, she wrote slowly and deliberately. I move forward from clarity, not fear. Reading the sentence back, she realized how far she had come. What surprised her most was how quickly she could now recognize misalignment. The moment old patterns tried to return, overthinking, catastrophizing, anticipating loss, she noticed them without judgment. Instead of spiraling, she paused. She wrote. She redirected herself gently. That ability felt like freedom. She understood then that manifestation wasn't a one-time event. It was a relationship. A relationship with her thoughts, her emotions, and the state she chose to inhabit daily. Financial stability was not something she had won. It was something she had learned how to sustain internally. That awareness reshaped her confidence. Not the loud kind, not the kind that needed validation, but a quiet certainty that she could trust herself. She trusted her ability to realign when necessary. To respond instead of react. to move forward without abandoning herself. And in that trust, she realized the deepest shift of all. She was no longer afraid of the future. Not because it was predictable, but because she knew how to meet it, grounded, aware, and aligned. Looking at her life now, it was hard to believe how deeply fear of the bills had once shaped her days. Not because the memory had disappeared, but because it no longer defined her. What once felt like a constant threat had become a chapter she could revisit without collapsing inside it. She hadn't erased her past, she had integrated it. She understood that losing her job hadn't been the end of her stability, even though it felt that way at the time. It had been the moment that exposed how much her inner world was living in scarcity, tension, and anticipation of loss. And only when that became visible could it begin to change. The law of attraction no longer felt mysterious or distant. It felt practical, lived, embodied. She had seen how fear had shaped her reality, and how alignment, practiced daily through awareness and the journal manifestation, had slowly reshaped it. Not by force, but by consistency. The journal remained close, not as a reminder of what she once lacked, but as a tool that helped her stay aligned with who she had become. Each page carried evidence of a woman who learned how to choose her emotional state with intention, even when circumstances were uncertain. She no longer measured her life by the absence of problems, but by the presence of stability inside herself. Money had stopped being a source of panic and started being a resource she could relate to with clarity and trust. That shift alone had changed everything. And if there was one truth she carried forward, it was this: financial stability didn't begin when income returned, it began the moment she stopped living in fear and chose alignment instead. From that place, life had finally been able to respond. This wasn't a story about luck or timing. It was a story about awareness, intention, and the quiet power of choosing differently, one thought, one page, one aligned moment at a time.